Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, but please call me Alex, and I'm here to talk to everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today I'm joined by guests Saleh Nur of Oxfam Canada. Saleh, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me.
So, for folks who are meeting you for the first time, could you tell us a bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, I'm Saleh Nur, and I work with Oxfam Canada as an information systems and analytics specialist. And my core role is to oversee the MIS system that underpins the fundraising strategy at Oxfam.
For those that don't know what MIS means, what does it mean?
Sure. So these are the connected digital ecosystems, the platforms, softwares, and processes that drive the technology here.
Cool. So, tell me, how did you get started in the nonprofit space?
Sure. I studied business with a focus in market research back in the day, and I was working with market research and in Bangladesh because, well, that's where I'm from, and there is a fairly established development sector in Bangladesh, and my work bridged into social research and then M&E, and that's sort of my start in the development sector. The work built up from initial. I started off in the water, sanitation, and hygiene portfolio and started to build systems that look at outputs, inputs, and sort of establishing scale in those spaces. From there, the work sort of built organically into developing systems that were distributed because we had scale projects with many satellite offices. And I started experimenting with distributed open source systems, CRM systems, automated data collection, field data collection packages, and sort of stumbled into Salesforce from there. So that would be, in a nutshell, my entry into the nonprofits and also into Salesforce.
So, it sounds like you're very technical then. You have a very technical background, right?
I wouldn't say that. Honestly, I started off very non-technical, where Salesforce or the CS pieces are concerned. But over the years, I've tried to dig in to learn as much as I can. And more recently, I've done a master's in data science. So I am trying to move towards more quantitative, more modeling, and so on. So that is the intent.
Awesome. And then what brought your career to Oxfam?
Right. So we moved to Canada back in 2018. And one thing that I was very interested in is sort of completing the picture of the development sector, in that I had worked in several countries on the implementation side, all across Asia, several places in Africa, and so on, but always on the implementation side of it. So I wanted to know the fundraising aspects. I wanted a clearer picture of that space. And that was sort of core in driving me towards Oxfam. But also, as I mentioned before, I am from Bangladesh, and Oxfam does very interesting, very challenging pieces of work there. And I had been exposed to that work, and though I had not worked directly with them up to that point, so I was very interested, and that's what brought me to Oxfam.
So, Oxfam is a very well known international, multinational company. What does Oxfam Canada focus on?
Right. So I think our mission statement is fairly sort of poignant in that we mention inequality and patriarchy, and we use that as a roadmap towards ending poverty and injustice, right? So the programming is focused towards equality and empowerment. And more specifically, we do humanitarian response, so response to disasters, usually crises, famine, a lot of pandemic response as well. And then we do long-term development projects. And finally, advocacy and campaigning, working with local government, with big companies, and so on.
And then, because it is a multinational corporation, how, if at all, do Oxfams communicate with each other? Like, is there any overlap or communication or high level guidelines or principles that each Oxfam within each country would follow?
That is a very good question. In fact, Oxfam has sort of undertaken the One Oxfam initiative, which aligns a lot of the outward facing work and the policy work that we do. But at the staff level, at the engagement space, we do have presence in over 90 countries and headquarter spaces in 21 nations at this point. And all the affiliate staff have unified access to mail, communication services, cloud storage, global intranet, and so on. We also have company social spaces. Ours is powered by Facebook Workday, I believe, and there is a lot of activity there, interest-based groups, famous pet pages, and so on. So there is formal and informal coordination. Usually it is driven by sort of what department you're in or specific projects that you're working on. There is a good space for knowledge sharing, for technology sharing as well. And then at the confederacy level, sort of as a global confederacy, there are big policy pieces that are always happening where you could participate as part of committees and so on. So I believe those would be sort of the big pieces. Yeah.
So in that answer, you briefly touched a bit upon technologies. Is there other technologies that you guys leverage? For example, as we move this conversation more toward CRMs and technology in general, are there any systems that the various Oxfams share, or is it more of a model where each Oxfam decides what technology suits their best needs in their local space?
I believe it would be the latter, at least where Oxfam Canada is concerned. We are not sort of sharing technology servers or technology licensing broadly, but things like Power BI, for instance, our licensing is from the international space, right? So if we do need those discrete pieces, we do pull them. But for overall systems pieces, they are fairly country specific. That said, there are programs that will do something first where it will be successful or it'll be close to what the intent of your personal program is. And then it is quite fruitful to reach out to colleagues there to learn about their development cycles, leverage their learnings, and so on. So, as I said, there is learning, knowledge sharing, but not so much sort of distributed technology networks for broad pieces.
That makes sense. So before we deep dive into the technology side, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges you have not related to technology?
I believe right now, one thing that we are facing quite acutely is data security. And the reason I think that this is exacerbated is in the current period of sort of more digital work and a lot of companies going remote and so on, is that the fraud readiness of systems have been set up quite a bit higher than they used to. So a lot of the older models of sort of credit card acceptance and so on, those are challenged more than they were. So as a result, we'll have credit card failures, we'll have difficulties working within our system and so on. Related to that, a lot of standards that were previously thought of as optional, things like PCI DSS certifications, compliance pieces, which are still sort of held as optional certification, can often be leveraged by these financial processors to say, hey, if you don't have certification, we can't do business with you. And that's a situation that we've found ourselves in at the moment, where we're seeing sort of large parts of our revenue pools being tied up to requirements towards certification. So that is sort of one big piece that we have that we're dealing with. Along with that, we have sort of an awkward phase in our life cycle of sort of where our CRM sits right now, where we can't really look at upscale technologies like enterprise buildouts and so on, but sort of base NPSP and what it brings in a lot of its applications can be quite constraining for us. A lot of the processes that we employ right now, they might seem more auto manual as opposed to automatic. And these are difficult to work with towards scale up. So I think, security, compliance, and sort of working towards these pieces, right, to scale up our system, that's sort of where we are bottlenecked.
And just to remind my audience, the NPSP acronym that Saleh used, that stands for the Nonprofit Success Pack, which is the package that Salesforce uses for nonprofits. So you also mentioned, I think, before the show as well, in terms of scalability. What does that mean, the challenge of scalability?
I think the challenge is sort of twofold. It builds into what I was speaking to in terms of compliance. And if I can speak to this a bit more, the compliance sector that we are speaking about is PCI DSS And this refers to credit card processing compliance, right? In that you would have certain security measures, data security measures, physical security measures, system scans, audits, and so on, right? That are built into how many gifts you process through credit card volume. So what Oxfam has done traditionally is that we process a lot of our volume through external parties, through vendor networks, and so on. Increasingly, though, the card exposure risk has gone up quite a bit. And the vendor networks that we're working with, they are sort of the requirements of support are also sort of going up. So as we are looking to expand some of our public fundraising options and so on, the compliance requirement and the cost associated with it, they go significantly up one step to the next. We are doing workarounds to build up from it. We are also looking at technology integrations, new solutions, and so on. But yeah, I'm sure we can get into that as we go forward. But yeah, those would be sort of the scale up space that is difficult for us.
Then, in terms of the technology challenges, what would you say is the biggest one you have at the moment?
Sure. So this is just building out from what I mentioned before about auto manual processes, in that a lot of our processing is done through APIs, they're done through third-party connectors, they're done through us connecting directly with secure servers of our vendors and then pulling encrypted files, decrypting them, and pushing into our system. All these processes have some level of direct engagement and staff tied up with it. There is also pieces like reconciliation and so on. So the challenge here is that the proportionate staff time that's required to process these things, they go up quite a bit when you are sort of expanding your system, when you're looking to bring more volume in and so on. So the management pieces are sort of focused at how do we better leverage the work that goes in? How do we better, how do we get better quality out of it? And also sort of how do we move past some processes that could be automated towards, like moving from, say, data cleaning operations or batch build operations towards more data quality, data sorting, deduping operations, and so on, right? So the existing architecture that we have, it's also heavily reliant on the standard object set. So workarounds for field limits, things like, the contact object in Salesforce being very heavily overloaded. We have issues with processor bottlenecks in some of the peak season periods. And then obviously sort of the incoming data containing spam, the requirement for heavy data cleaning, data quality operations, things like that. Speaking away from sort of the core technology requirements, you might be familiar. Nonprofits tend to hold on to a lot of their giving data. So at Oxfam Canada, we have gift data, specific gift data dating back, say, 2 decades, right? 20 years. So how do we work with that kind of data set in the constraints of Salesforce's sort of high per usage cost, right? The data costs go up significantly with gift volume and so on. So yeah, I think those would be like the key technology challenges that we have.
Yeah, 20 years of data. How do you manage it? Like, where is the balance between usefulness versus just thoroughness?
That is a very good question, and one that we have grappled with in the past and that we can do so. The solution that was sort of implemented in our system, and this is dating back several years now, but what was done was the single gift entries, which sort of are the biggest data piece because they're tied to a number of things. In the Salesforce architecture, for example, they're tied down to sort of whether the gift is reserved or unreserved. What GOU allocation does it go to? The specific payment record, right? All these things they're assigned to. So the solution was to compress all the relevant gift data of individuals onto a consolidated gift up to a certain date. And then going forward, and I believe this date sits somewhere comfortably in 2011. And then going forward, we have individual records. The data archiving question is something that we are still grappling with because just like I said, the amount of data we generate around that is going up with the volume that's coming in. So it is something that we do need to grapple with. We are looking at things like big data objects, or in Salesforce, but at the moment we don't have a solution around it.
But it's a good problem to have when you've got so much data, you don't know where to put it. I mean, that is a challenging but good problem to have.
For sure. And we have it sort of wrapped neatly and kept safe so that once we do have a solution, we're ready to unpack that and build into a system where we can usefully use it, but not overburden the front end users with sort of all that data.
Right. So you've already alluded to the fact that you guys use Salesforce. What other main technology systems do you use?
Sure. So our primary CRM is Salesforce, just like you mentioned, and we're using the base NPSP package with a number of additions. Our funds are processed through IATS, which is a payment processor gateway that's also integrated into Salesforce through a patching called Brickworks. So that's sort of the program that runs it. And then our forward-facing communication, our appeals and campaigns and so on, these are maintained through Engaging Networks. That's another platform that we are connected to, sort of dual channel with Salesforce, in that, gifts updated there come back to Salesforce, and things, say contact updates or cases that are updated within Salesforce, they go back and update on Engaging Networks. We have a few other integrations, including we have a Shopify shop, which is called our Unwrapped program. We have several vendor platforms that we deal with, things like Evergiving, Public Outreach. You will have, say, public face-to-face fundraising happens on the streets, and there are platforms that are connected back into our system. And then we have a number of plugins that deal with discrete functions. For instance, tax receipting, which is done in our instance through Kel. I believe these are the major pieces.
Can you speak a bit more about the Unwrapped program? What does that mean? What does it do? How do people use it?
Yeah, for sure. So the Unwrap program is a shop hosted on Shopify, and it is integrated back into our system. At the moment, we're using a third-party integration for it to go in. And basically, it is a shop where you can purchase Oxfam cards, fairly interesting sort of gifts that you can pick up there. You can do gifts in tribute and in memoriam and so on. And it feeds back into our system as sort of, the gifts come in as they are. And then there's a number of things data-wise that happens, like product systems and so on, that I won't get into. But yeah, it's unwrapped at oxfam.ca.
Yeah, we can share that link in the show notes as well. And then in terms of donations, what system do you use for that? For example, if I wanted to be a donor, I'm somewhere in Canada, wants to make a donation of a certain amount, where would I go?
Right. So we do have our sort of on the back end, we do our donations either directly into our systems or through Engaging Networks. So we have two discrete channels of how donations are processed. But in terms of sort of where you would be giving, those are web pages that are hosted on Engaging Networks. So as a supporter, you would be getting appeals, you would be getting notes and campaigns and so on. And so pieces that would come in through our Engaging Networks platform.
So if I understand correctly, Engaging Networks does appeals, outreach. It also does donations. You can make payments through it. So it really seems to be a one-stop shop for most of the donation management side, the fundraising side of things. Is that right?
That is correct. It is sort of our primary front-facing portal for fundraising. Yeah. There are a number of pieces that do not fall into that space. Things like major gifts, things like giving alternate means of payments, things like stocks or estates and legacies. But generally speaking, our public fundraising is heavily geared towards the Engaging Network space.
One reoccurring theme that I've noticed in the fundraising space is the question, or at least the discussion about accepting cryptocurrencies as a type of donation. Have you breached that topic at Oxfam?
That is an interesting point, one that I have not had conversation with my immediate colleagues on, but I believe I mentioned previously our social space. I believe there is a conversation brewing there. So if new developments come up there, it would be interesting to look at. I do want to share, however, that sort of as we broadened spaces where we took in payments, right? As we broadened sort of the payment processors that we work with, our experience with all the processor platforms haven't been the same. I want to mention briefly, like we are doing some fundraising through PayPal, and PayPal is fairly established, but the support network that PayPal has here in Canada isn't as strong as it is in other spaces. So we've struggled to sort of fully integrate it into our space. So, the challenges of bringing in crypto, of verifying the transactions and so on, I believe that will be an interesting puzzle that we will probably get into in the coming years.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing where this conversation goes as well. So, with all this, I mean, there's a lot of activity obviously happening within Oxfam. How do you measure engagement and how do you measure impact of your constituents?
That is an excellent question. So, what we do in the information systems team, which is sort of my small team, is we are sort of internal client support with primarily the fundraising team. And what we do is we will have the dynamic reporting of the data. We'll have dashboards and reports set up where the team can track sort of the progress of their work with their donors. The spaces that the fundraising team, sort of the public fundraising side of it, is looking at primarily are broadly sort of the differentiation between one-time gifts and regular givers. If you are sort of familiar with the fundraising cycle here, is that a lot of dollars are spent in bringing regular donors into the fold because the setup of sort of supporting the program is heavily reliant on that. And the engagement pieces around outgoing communication, the engagement pieces around appeals, and so on. In terms of software, what we're looking at is backfeed data in a lot of spaces. So, for instance, if an appeal goes out in engaging networks and it's targeted towards a specific demographic, a specific contingent of people, the initial sort of outgoing segment that's coded out in Salesforce will decide the code and the segments and build out the links that bind the two platforms together between Salesforce and engaging networks. As the appeals go out, they will go through the channels in engaging networks, they will go through mailing, or they will go through some other channel. And then the updates are as the appeals hit the mailboxes of our target audience, sort of we'll get updates on sort of how it's going, we'll get updates on responses and so on, and that's backfed into Salesforce. There is additional work when this is not done through either through the standard appeal system, or this is done with like an older set, a follow-up to an existing appeal, and so on, where we will get backfeed files from sort of how it's set up, and we'll do updates in Salesforce as a result. So broadly speaking, that's how those moving pieces go.
So, I understood that you focus your attention more on the reoccurring donations, or at least try to convert people to becoming a reoccurring donor rather than having just a bunch of one time donations. Is that right?
Any giving is very useful for the program, but a lot of sort of the planning and the building, right? The long-term processing of it is reliant on the recurring donors. And they also represent sort of the most engaged and the most like the regular connection points for Oxfam within sort of who we work with. So they're very useful for campaigning, they're very useful for communications outside and so on. So yes, that is sort of where the key focus is.
Do you have any insider information about tips or strategies to get people to move from one-time donors to becoming recurring donors?
I can only speak to sort of the back end data space of it. I do want to say that in the recent processes, we've done deep dives into the data and how it looks like, how it moves. And honestly, there is a lot to look at in terms of attrition, in terms of sort of movement and transition, migration channels. But it would be sort of disingenuous of me to speak more on it because it is definitely not my strength.
No, but you raise a good point. It's very valuable. I mean, you have a rich tapestry of data, right? And it's great to see that you're actually using that data to decide approaches and strategies and try to new things versus just throwing darts at a dartboard and see what sticks.
That is an interesting sort of picture that you use in terms of the tapestry, in that when you have data spanning several years or decades, it doesn't always mesh well, and a lot of work is required to get it to play nice. So it has been very interesting and also somewhat challenging to sort of build those more intensive pieces. But yes, it has been a very sort of interesting projects and also rewarding ones.
So obviously the hub of your CRM is Salesforce. Um, Salesforce can do a lot of things very well, and there are some things it doesn't do so well, and that's why you have add-ons like Engaging Networks, like Kel, like IATS. So could you tell me the things you love most about Salesforce, the features and the functionality or the usefulness or the usability of Salesforce?
Certainly. As I mentioned before, my entry into sort of working with Salesforce and working with these systems, it was fairly organic. And what I found to be the biggest selling point for Salesforce is the accessibility, the learning, and the growth options that it came with. And this was back in, I believe, either 2012 or 2013, where a lot of these platforms were they had an initial block in terms of people who could get in, start admin, start developing, and so on. So, as a self starter, Salesforce is a wonderful platform and has been for a while, and it gives you a lot of room to grow. And this is not only for the admins or the developers, it's also for the front end users. There is, I believe, engagement for every user level, things like chatter. We have cases that a lot of the specific teams engage in. We have tasks and follow-ups, and also, as I mentioned before, things like reports and dashboards that can be scheduled, that can be sent as snapshots, and so on. So it is very well suited to being utilized as sort of a multi-access tool. And also the integrations and the connectivity and flexibility that you've mentioned before, I believe that would be sort of hand in hand with the accessibility, make it a system that is very well poised to be sort of the CRM of choice for these programs where so many different things are happening.
And then on the flip side of things, what do you find the most challenging to do, or what is most challenging about Salesforce?
That is, I believe, this is more of a management piece, but expectation setting for a system like Salesforce can be a bit of work. And I believe it is good work, but essentially because the system is open and it is very easy to bring sort of new ideas forward and think about trying things out, it can quickly get out of hand. A system like Salesforce, you need to set expectations, you need to have a stable baseline that you're working towards, and it needs to be sort of clearly communicated what the mission of the system is. And Salesforce does a lot in bringing different things together, but I found the lack of sort of a native process documentation system, something you would find in ArcGIS or an SAS platform, to be somewhat lacking, because once you start building or once you start looking back into a build, it can be difficult to get all the pieces to play nice. And having a not having a documentation, I believe, is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I know that there are a few add-ons you can use with Salesforce to help with that, but I know what you mean that the documentation process, it really depends actually on your implementation partner, right? If they did a good job, then all the fields they added, all the objects they added will have some kind of descriptor to it. That helps. But there's, of course, more advanced tools out there, packages you can add to get even a higher level of documentation within the system. But it all depends on your partner. So if a nonprofit was considering using a CRM, why would you recommend Salesforce, or under what conditions or what scenarios would you caution them against using Salesforce?
So I have used Salesforce in a number of applications. In my previous work, I have used it as a project management tool, a inventory management tool, sort of queue management, issue tracking, grant management as well. It is very flexible, and the width of things you can do with it is very interesting. But once again, you need to have a cohesive plan when committing to CRM, because it's not just the upfront cost of it or sort of the build out requirement, but the investment is sort of multi-level and applies to like entire operation cultures and work teams. If the plan for a new organization is to look into Salesforce, I would say very much sort of figuring out where it would sit capacity wise. This is a conversation that I've had with partners within Oxfam, within the development sector as a whole, but it is very important to look at sort of where your current system sits and where it needs to be in 5 years. And the reason for that is that the costs associated with Salesforce, they're heavily tied to the user licenses and the space requirement, the sort of the number of gigabytes you need for them. And it can be a wonderful tool to have, but it can quickly also sort of become a big item on your budget line. So I think Salesforce has become very good at positioning themselves towards small organizations and large organizations. But for mid-sized organizations, I believe that a good bit of consideration is required to approach it. However, sort of as a platform, because of the accessibility piece, the integrations and the connectivity, sort of all the great things that I've mentioned before, it is very enticing to look at it and also know that Salesforce as a whole is always growing, they're innovating. So something where you might not have an out of the box solution right now, it might be there, in their next development cycle. So yeah, it is a very interesting question. And I think it is very dependent on sort of your own use case as you look to assess.
I've also seen that based on the size of the nonprofit, there's a decision to have certain people in house that have certain Salesforce experience, a Salesforce administrator, for example. At Oxfam, do you guys have one or multiple administrators? You work with a partner. How do you make changes within Salesforce or to Salesforce within Oxfam?
Within the Oxfam Confederacy, I would not be able to tell you how many Salesforce admins we have. I do know that development is happening sort of by itself organically in different country programs. In the Canada program, we've used Salesforce for a number of years. And at the moment, we have one certified admin within our team. And we have sort of analysts who are sort of geared towards working with Salesforce in the fundraising team as well. Additionally, we work with a number of partners, either developers and consultants who are working with us and who we have sort of a service relationship with. And then we have developers coming in from our vendor networks, from new products that we're testing and so on. So there are different assets that we employ for our requirements, but heavily we rely on some of our consultants to do sort of the core development work and the core testing pieces.
So, what is the future of Oxfam Canada? Where would you like to see things in the next coming years?
So right now, Oxfam Canada is well supported by our government, by GAC, and our priorities are in fairly strong alignment with the development objectives. But our leadership recognizes that realistically, that's not a static relationship. So we are hoping to sort of leverage our current strengths and bolster our public fundraising to be a more independent and sort of have a stronger voice in going forward. So the intent is to invest in that space, to invest in the staff, in the programs, and hopefully the infrastructure as well, fingers crossed, and sort of build from there. So that's sort of the scale up expectation in the coming term.
So then what lessons has Oxfam learned over the past 2 years through the pandemic that you expect to carry forward?
So when we entered the pandemic, our leadership took fairly early and fairly supportive, strong decisions. The work from home piece, sort of moving payment processing and other things online. And we spent sort of a few months frantically getting things done and trying to figure processes out as we went. And generally that worked, but it was obviously stressing the system. Specifically for our instance, we found that the in-office requirement of the donor relations team, right, in sort of opening mails, in doing processing, having the processing safe room that we had back in office, those things we had to find workarounds for. Some of the key takeaways for us was sort of finding the sweet spot of what could be done through technology and what needed to be sort of moved in a hybrid pattern. As we sort of learned lessons and grew and moved from sort of the initial rush of just balancing, we found technology partners that we could work with. We found pieces that we could outsource and also sort of maintain connections. And there was a bit of system shock, but it was sort of growing pains, I suppose, and it set us up for a lot of sort of where we are currently. At the same time, I mentioned our leadership did a wonderful job. There was sort of clear communication from them in terms of what was sort of expected of us in terms of getting back into the office, where we could work from. And I have to briefly mention that sort of we opened up hiring across Canada. We removed the term limits of a lot of the positions that were tied down to term limits and so on. And these were done to build the security and sort of nullify some of the turnover sort of concerns that we had sort of going into the pandemic. For our system specifically, a lot of the new vendors that we brought on, they brought innovations in terms of processing, things like scanning and ICR pieces, and a lot of it fed back into Salesforce, and it sort of kicked off development requirements, but those were pieces that we had to get around. As we sit right now, I think we are well poised to sort of build more steps. Like I mentioned before, we have a lot of processes that are auto manual that are tied down to how much sort of time that we can invest. And we are looking to, one of the big pieces for us is to have a standardized onboarding and processing pipeline for our vendors. And we're working towards this with an ETL build out that we are hoping, will be powered by MuleSoft, and we're sort of working out the initial design plans of it. But once that is in place, we will be a lot more secure in terms of who we can take on as partners with our work, vendors that we can place, and then a lot of the work requirements move from initial processing or admin processing towards data quality.
Hey, listen, this has been great. For people who are excited maybe to want to join the Oxfam movement, who want to get engaged with your amazing team, where can they find more about you and about Oxfam?
Right. So I think the best way to be sort of part of our movement is to be proactive, is to take action. You can always campaign with us. You can do your political leaders with the big business, and we do that on a regular basis. The other sort of big engagement piece is around sort of giving. Obviously, for an organization like Oxfam, when you give regularly, and we've discussed some of the alternatives and some of the spaces in this call, but yeah. Our lots of alternatives, our shops, our Unwrapped program. You can do things like fundraising with us. There are hosted events that you can do through Oxfam, and have us in your space, talk about Oxfam, and connect with us.
Saleh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Alex.
All right, folks, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again next time for Agents of Nonprofit.